Well, hello and welcome to Insight with political tours and beyond the headlines. The United States has promised to withdraw all of its troops from Afghanistan by September the 11th of this year. According to the US Forces paper, The Stars and Stripes, they could be out even sooner, next month possibly. But what does this leave behind? 20 years after the West intervened, Afghanistan is still at war, but also has radically changed in many areas of life. We're here to learn about what the country is like today and what impact the US withdrawal may have. We have two wonderful guests to explore all of that with us. They are Lima Halima-Ahmed, a former advisor to the Afghan president, Ashraf Ghani, and a women's rights expert. Hello and welcome, Lima. Lima, I think you're in Istanbul at the moment. And I think there we go. I think your microphone was just closed there. We also have Lynne O'Donnell, one of the best known foreign journalists to cover the region. She was formerly AP and AFP's bureau chief in Kabul and continues to write regularly about the country. She joins us from Kabul. Hello, Lynne.
Hi, Nick. Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, our first task is an apparently simple one, and that's to explore what Afghanistan is like today. How much has it changed since 2001? So I'm going to start with you, Lima, and perhaps we can take you back to before 2001. Can you say something about your own family life, a life partly in exile, but also about living with the Taliban?
Thank you, Nicholas. Actually, we became refugee during the civil wars. So I have not lived the Taliban era in Afghanistan. We were actually in Pakistan. So we moved to Pakistan and came back to Afghanistan in early 2002 when the Taliban rule was not anymore in the country. So for me, my early memories of the Taliban were as a refugee kid of believing that I don't have a home anymore, like we were refugee, and with the hope that someday we will go. So, but life after 2001 back home was alive. There was nothing where I could say that Afghanistan was not a livable place, or Afghanistan, how we saw and still see it as this far land where people are still living in Stone Age. They are still not connected with the world. That was not the case. We kind of felt that the 7 or 9 years of Taliban era was kind of a dark era where the country stopped. Not only the people, the entire country stopped living. So that is my early memories of the Taliban and Taliban era and my own upbringing as a refugee kid in Pakistan, and so many alike my own generation. But Taliban era didn't end it there. So the past 20 years continued living with the fear of someday there will be an attack and I will be there. And faced so many suicide attacks, lost so many friends, lost a family member recently. So I think the Taliban era was never out of our life during the past 2 decades as well, but it never felt that they are ruling us. It felt like it was a group of terrorists that we all were fighting. We all were facing to somehow, someday, it will stop. So that's how specifically about Taliban. But about Afghanistan is as normal country as any other country. We live there. There is not only one culture. We are a multicultural country. There is life. There is art. There is history to it, which we really hear about it in the media.
Yeah, okay. Lynne, I'm keen to get your perspectives. You spent really the majority of your past 20 years reporting in the region. I'm doing a funny thing in a way. I'm trying to sort of divorce the conflict from the day-to-day lives of people, which is, I know, not realistic. But can we sort of try to build up a picture of what it's living like in a rural area, what it's living like in the cities, but also some of the big changes that you might have seen over those 2 past decades for those people?
I think, as Lima said, the Taliban never really disappeared. The presence of the extremists has been a very real one, especially since about 2004, 2005. There may have been a hiatus after 2001 when they went over the border into Pakistan, but then they were under the leadership especially were under the protection of the Pakistani authorities, notably the intelligence agency. And they had a time to regroup and rearm and build up a force of men again, thanks to the patronage of the Pakistani authorities. And so once the war began in earnest around about 2005, 2006, the Taliban became very much a part of people's lives in the countryside and in the cities, like Lima said. So life is as what people make it. They get up in the morning and they go to work, they send their kids to school, but in the past 10 years or so, the uncertainty that has gone with that, where people don't know if they'll be, greeting their husbands, wives, children back home again in the afternoon, has become a very real part of their lives landscape. And that has an impact on the psychology of a country. The violence is ever present, and the numbers of people who are injured, killed, and impacted by the violence is astounding. The United Nations didn't start keeping figures of casualties until 2009. And since then, they've documented 47,000 civilian deaths and casualties. And if you...
What I want to try and do, if possible, is try and because I think the conflict is obviously one of the key things we're going to talk about. But if you don't know Afghanistan at all, how does a farmer make his living? How much of the city's grown in the last of 10, 15 years? What is life like in the cities? So if you can just give people an aspect of, if you were to land in Kabul today, or if you go into a rural area or an urban area, I just want to get a flavor of what life is like from day to day.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, I did start rabbiting on, didn't I? Kabul is immensely crowded and busy. I can say from a professional standpoint, it's the busiest city that I've ever lived in. You arrive here and you're immediately struck with the levels of security that are necessary. And I came back 3 weeks ago. I hadn't been here for 4 years, and I lived here for a long time before I left in 2017. And it's immediately evident that the streets are narrower because there are more concrete T-walls and HESCO bags everywhere. The traffic is horrendous because what was a very well thought out and planned grid is now truncated by closed roads, and there are military vehicles on the roads. But there is also very troubled power supply. So even the smallest shops have to have generators. So the noise on the streets, you have to cross a street and go over an open ditch which stinks into a line of shops along a footpath, all of which have got small generators out. So the belching of the smoke and the noise. So it's really you get quite a feeling of chaos, to be honest with you, busy, chaotic. But aside from that, the people are very colourful, well-dressed, take a lot of pride in themselves. There seems to be a fashion at the moment amongst men to wear very brightly coloured and different coloured shalwar kameez. So you see bright pink and bright green and beautiful royal blues. So it's a city with its own identity and with great pride, and it's busy and people are moving around. We're locked down now for the third wave of COVID, so the traffic is a little bit better than normal. It doesn't take long when the other thing that should be said is that Kabul was built for less than or around about 500,000 people, and now there's about 5 million people living here. So that has its own problems of demand and crowding and chaos. When you go out into the countryside, it's very bucolic. It's like anywhere else. People are living in villages and tilling their land and growing crops, and as is very well known, the major cash crop in Afghanistan is opium poppy. There was just some really fierce fighting down in the south, which is the Taliban basically protecting their routes, their supply routes to get the poppy, the opium, the raw opium out to wherever it needs to go. That's an annual, biannual occurrence. So yeah, and there's, farming goes on, life goes on. Yeah,
okay.
People live.
Thank you for that. That's very useful. Lima, in just a second, I am going to talk to you about what's happened to your family. And there is a tragedy, a terrible tragedy that's taken place in your family. We'll talk about that in just a second. But I do want to bring home some of the changes that have taken place within Afghanistan in the last 2 years. You've worked in the last 20 years. You've worked very closely on women's rights. Indeed, that was your responsibility when you were working with the president. Can you just give me a flavor of those kind of changes, how women have been empowered, but also the kind of how society has changed with this impact, this opening up or influence from the outside world?
I agree with a lot of what Lynne said about the Kabul side of it, and rest of the cities, provincial cities of Afghanistan are similar. But when we look at not at the security or political side of it, Afghanistan has changed. It has become as any other country in the world. Like, people order food online. There are taxi services that you put it on mobile phone and order. Like, changes like that. Everywhere you go, there are schools. You will see women, a lot of girls on street going to school. So life has changed a lot. Like, even the generation which was born after the Taliban rule, or even when they were younger, they don't remember not to be going to school, they don't remember not to have a smartphone, not to be connected on social media. So those are the changes which somehow you feel empowered, even comparing yourself with women or society as a whole when they didn't have access to those things. So women in Afghanistan right now, I am following the peace process and how much women are involved with their advocacy work and stuff like that for my school. But where I compare Afghan women activism compared to any other conflict zone where women involvement was there, I cannot even begin with saying that how much Afghan women are now active. If it is at the government level, if it's a civil society, if it is students, they push a lot. Although there is this drawback from international community, from the Afghan government, from the society itself. But women in Afghanistan, they just say, like, this rights that I have, it is not given. It's like mine. I have to push back. I cannot go back 20 years ago and just be at home and not have access to education, to work, to a normal life. So for the past 20 years, of course, a lot has changed. We have more than 9 million students in school right now. We have more than 1,700 female civil servants. We have more than 6,000 women in police and army. So these are just the small statistics number where we could, if we put all these numbers together, these numbers are more than the Taliban full soldier. So of course they are in power and number, and also they are more aware of what is happening in the world and how much it will cost them if Taliban come back. So if we call that empowerment and what has changed, of course, a lot has changed in Afghanistan.
This is obviously a threat in many ways to the sort of male patriarchy that the Taliban represent in many ways. I want to talk to you about your sister. Fatima Khalil was killed 1 year ago. Can you tell us how that happened and what impact it's had?
Yeah, so my sister, she studied in the Central American University of Central Asia, and she just graduated in 2019, and she was a human rights activist. That was what she studied, and she wanted to work in war zone, not only in Afghanistan, everywhere. But of course, Afghanistan, when it comes to human rights violation, you start it from home. And she was quite excited by starting, and that was her first job. She started working with Afghanistan Independence Human Rights Commission. So after seven months on her job, her car was bombed. She died with her driver right there. So it has been a year. It's been a year, and I think she was one of the first few assassination that started with the U.S. Taliban agreement after that. And that really shocked.
Why do you think they targeted her specifically?
We have a lot of theories, but in my own personal opinion, as I mentioned before, there is a big population of Afghanistan that they don't remember Taliban era, which in Western view, we would call them Z generation, that were born or they were really young in the Taliban era. So that generation is not different than any young people around the world. They have access to knowledge, they have access to technology, they feel entitlement to life, to a normal life. And that population is around 45% of the country right now in Afghanistan. So scaring them, and also how to remind them to rule them, because their life is cafes life, nightlife, they have access to everything. How would you allow that? Like women, they go outside, they drive of their generation. So how you will just control this generation that does not remember how Taliban rule? So for me, my theory is that they have to create extreme violence to scare women like Natasha, to scare her generation either to leave country or accept, because losing her, even if you talk to a lot of her friends, they have just lost hope. They just don't want to live in Afghanistan because they believe working for your country is good, but that should not cost your life. Because this generation is much more practical.
You in particular are concerned about your immediate future and your family's immediate future.
Of course, we are worried about. I am not only worried about my future and my family. I am worried about the entire country. Like the country has revived up for the past 20 years, and if we go back, we will not go. There won't be only extreme violence and loss of many lives, but economically and socially, we will become a country where it will take 100 years to come back where we are. For me, as a kid, when we left Afghanistan refugee, my parents did try to make this kind of feeling in us that we have to go back. It's our country. For now, if the country is again at violence and people leave, what will make us educate the next generation to be connected to Afghanistan, to work for Afghanistan? So for us, I was born in war and still living in war. What will make me interested in Afghanistan to educate my children to remain committed to Afghanistan if it is again a violent place and violence continues?
Lynne, you wrote an article very recently in the Tortoise that gives you a sense of that, fin de siècle is the word you used, this idea that the violence is the assassinations being stepped up, there's heightened security. What do you think are going to be the immediate effects of the US withdrawal?
I think that we're seeing them already, and what happened to Natasha is a part of that. There is a very great uncertainty, and it's the uncertainty that is really creating fear amongst ordinary Afghan people, amongst professionals, journalists, people who work in civil society, women who work professionally and do what women like me do and work hard on their career and advance. We saw a couple of women judges killed in the street quite a few months ago. Journalists have been killed also on their way to work as they step out of their front outdoors. What it does is it forces people to censor themselves. And I'm not just talking about journalists self-censoring. I'm talking about people curtailing and rolling back their own expectations and aspirations. At the end of 2014, when the NATO combat missions ended, there was a great deal of panic, and there were an awful lot of people who left the country. And arguably, you could say that the end of the combat mission was what led to the immigration crisis in Western Europe, with young men especially leaving Afghanistan because they were afraid and because jobs dried up. I don't think we're seeing quite the same level of departure, but certainly panic. And what that means is that in the media, for instance, when you have high profile, highly competent journalists are being killed and threatened, they leave their profession, or they curtail their involvement in their profession, and standards then drop. And what you see is a compliance with and a second guessing of what will keep them safe. And so the advancement stops. And I think that there is a great fear, and Lima has expressed it very well, that development stops. Everyone here's got an iPhone, a smartphone, or they're all on the internet. The society is open, unlike the neighbours, Pakistan, China, the stands, Iran on the other side, where media access is very tightly controlled. Afghan people can access anything they want. But then the question is, what is it that they are able to access? And will the involvement of other countries, like China, for instance, which is already very close to the Taliban, lead to a strangulation of rights and access and media openness? I think that's one of the great fears. Whether it will happen or not, I don't know, but I think the second guessing is already happening, and that may become self-fulfilling.
I'm very interested that you make that connection sort of between the causation with the scaling down of NATO involvement to 2014 and the refugee crisis, people coming through Afghanistan. Obviously, it wasn't just Afghanistan, it was Syria, North Africa. Lima, I would put it to you, and this is what many people in the West would say, is that we've been there for long enough. It's time you looked after yourselves, and really, you don't matter that much to us anyway. It's not as if you're in North Africa or on the Balkans. What you do doesn't really affect us, and really need to get on with it.
Yeah, I will start with a quote a few days ago I saw by one of the former European ambassadors there. He put the current situation really well, that the Taliban are not ready for peace, and the current government of Afghanistan is not able to govern the country, and the Americans are running away. That's exactly how it is, in my opinion. So the last 20 years that we are talking about, we usually put it in numbers. How many US troops or the international troops, NATO, were in Afghanistan, and how much money is spent. We usually put that in the figures, state to state relationship. Usually we ignore what happened in the country. We ignore the people of the countries, what happened during these 20 years. The 20 years intervention in Afghanistan was not just with the numbers of troops and money. The country was changed. A lot of changes were brought. I would not specifically say westernization was brought, but a culture was built around this 20 years. Living that, and throughout the 20 years, we said we are there for Afghan people. We are there to save Afghan women. We are there to develop the country. But at once we just say we are tired. So what about this 20 years old child, which is that you will leave to the extremists, so they will just break it apart. For me, country like Afghanistan, which is changing or becoming transitional kind of democratic country, we just can't abandon them, because it's just, there are many cultures that are brought into the countries, and it needs accountability towards it. We need to be sure, like, for example, if we have brought iPhone, Facebook, Twitter, like once we go out, what are the consequences of that? If we have brought any other kind of culture, if it is homophobia, if it is anything, what it will cost the Afghan people, not the state? Because right now we are thinking about the republic.
I guess the question is, why should that be the responsibility of Western taxpayers and Western governments?
But the responsibility of taxpayers was when they went there, and right? They went and they spent 20 years there. Now, I don't think so. There is any Afghan that are asking for you should stay there forever, but it has to be a planned exit, an exit where Afghans will come and work with the international community, how we can make it less risky, this exit. Because right now, from where I see it, the international community is creating chaos. Oh, we are leaving our embassy because everybody will be killed once we leave. So that kind of creating of chaos is changing the psychology that, oh, we have to wait for a violence to break.
So that's the message that's being conveyed. And I know, Lynne, you've spoken about this. The Australian embassy has just closed down, is that right?
Yes. And the Brits have talked about moving to somewhere safer, and the French may leave as well, and other Europeans may consolidate inside the European Union compound. It's just playing into a devastating narrative that isn't being countered. So you have the Taliban are winning the information war, and as we know, that's a really important component of any hot war is the information. It's all being handed to the Taliban on a plate. There isn't anything to counter it. I can't get a hold of anybody at the Resolute Support Mission a mile down the road to give me a briefing. I can't get anyone from the Ministry of Defence in the UK to talk to me. I was in touch with the Australian embassy before I arrived because I'm Australian. Hi, I'm coming. There was absolutely no word from them that they were going to close. They just cut and run without even telling people at the Ministry of Interior or the Foreign Affairs Ministry here. It was really quite shameful. What they're doing is feeding into a negative narrative that really has no substance. The Taliban are fighting very, very hard. The madrasas over on the Pakistan side of the border have closed. There's young men up the wazoo who are joining the fight, and they're there ready and willing to fight on the Taliban side because they get money to do it, and so do their families. They haven't taken any substantial territory. They're moving into villages and districts. They haven't moved into cities, provincial capitals. They haven't taken any provinces. They're being pushed out again. This has been the argy-bargy back and forth on the battlefield for years. There is a status quo. There isn't even a stasis. There's a status quo. But nobody is saying that the Afghan forces are going to rout Taliban. It's all about the Taliban are going to come in and take the airport. And there's going to be a Saigon-style departure with helicopters off the roof of the American embassy. I just can't see it happening. I can't see a counter to the narrative, which is shameful on the part of the allies, and they are creating and stirring up a chaos that is not necessary.
Right, so essentially what you're saying, or what both of you are saying, there's a moral responsibility. Okay, yes, there was a military goal, and perhaps that hasn't been won, but whatever that goal was, the amount of time and money that's been spent there links Afghanistan in some way morally with the West. You can't just leave a vacuum.
Well, if I may answer that, what happens in Afghanistan does affect the rest of the world, as we saw in 2001. The Taliban signed an agreement with the United States in which they said that they would cut ties with Al-Qaeda, and they would make sure that Afghanistan was never used again as a point from which international terrorist attacks on the United States, on the homeland, were conducted. It's very well known, everybody here, every Afghan knows that the ties with Al-Qaeda haven't been cut. It's like taking the salt out of the sea. It's a symbiotic relationship. You have the Haqqani network, which is also enmeshed at the very top levels of the Taliban movement and with Al-Qaeda. So if you're not going to hold the Taliban accountable to the conditions of the deal that they've signed, while the Afghan government is accountable and is constantly being told off for the vast levels of corruption that exist within it and being held accountable, and a lot of the money that goes to the Afghan government from the international community is held off budget, etc., etc. The only people who are getting away with anything in this deal are the Taliban, and the Americans are handing it to them. The allies and NATO are handing it to them. It's a shameful. You say there's a moral obligation. There's just a professional obligation. Do your job. You've got public affairs officers. Do your job. Okay. Spin it. Everybody else does, and the Taliban are winning that.
Okay. Let's bring in questions now. So everyone, please start putting your questions in the Q&A box here. We've got a first question here from Tim Ripley. Go ahead, Tim, and just say what you do as well, Tim.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm a journalist. I work in the UK and I cover defence matters. And I agree totally about Lynne, with your idea about the news blackout that the British MOD and the other NATO allies have imposed, and it's also linked quite significantly to this issue of interpreters, because in the UK and the US, immigration is a major problem with the British Conservative Party and in the US as well, and the idea of the British Armed Forces evacuating 3,000 Afghans and their families to the United Kingdom right now and putting them up, accommodating them and looking after them at the moment where the British Border Force is trying to stop anybody coming across the channel, is the narrative is just toxic for the British government's
when the Germans took in 1.2 million refugees 5 years ago. The comparison is ghastly.
But for the British government, they are obsessed by what the Daily Mail will say about how the British government's providing palatial lifestyles for these. It's just toxic. So you have that thing playing into the news blackout. They're desperate to avoid a picture of Afghans getting off a plane in London or in Britain being housed, and what that will do for the immigration debate. But the question I like to put to Lynne and Lima is how resolute do you think the Afghan government will be to stand up to the Taliban? Because I know my Afghan history, and there is the civil war, all the warlords, they're still there. They're not going to surrender. They're not going to, flee. They're ready for a fight. They will protect their domains. So, how do you think they will react to the
Okay, well, let's put that question to Lima first of all. Putting aside, your obvious concerns, how do you think the government is going to fare? What are your immediate predictions in terms of how the government is going to respond to the continued Taliban insurgency?
I think that Taliban insurgency is not only physical, but it's a lot to do with how psychological narrative we have seen. I think Taliban became a big monster now, more in the media and how we feel how powerful they are. So it really affects, because I was within the government. I was the person who was seeing the Ministry of, doing the assessment of Ministry of Defense and Interior. So even putting Taliban's foot soldier to the foot soldier what the government has, there is no comparison. But the problem where I mentioned before, this idea of there will be violence, this is where I think the government is losing. And government after the US withdrawal will not be only facing the Afghan Taliban, they will be facing a lot more. They will be facing the warlords that are mad right now at Ashraf Ghani, specifically because the Republic right now that we are talking, it has become this specific government. It's not even the kind of system that we want to run the country where that it has become more about individual running the government right now. So for me, the Afghan government has lost it to the people itself, the Afghan people, because when the agreement between the US and the Taliban happened was people felt like, okay, you have asked the Taliban not to kill the Americans, you are free to do anything. So that was the time when the killing of Afghans became more obvious, that the Taliban were pushing the Afghan government. And we specifically are mad at the Afghan government. As a state, we voted for you, but there is no basic security. Like, you cannot protect us from the Taliban or any insurgent group. So the government might not have any support from the people, not that the people want Taliban, but they don't feel protected by the Afghan government. So the Afghan government will be facing Taliban, warlords, Pakistan, and there won't be any support from the people because people are running for their lives. They don't know how to save themselves. So that would be my
You're talking about a vacuum. You're talking about a vacuum.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Let's I know, Lynne, you've got thoughts on that too, but let's bring in Philip Godfrey, who's got a question, and then Lynne, I'll put that to you. You can also answer the earlier question from Tim as well. But go ahead, Philip.
Thanks, Nick. Lynne, you mentioned in passing very briefly the relationship between the Chinese government, well, China and the Taliban, and I was assuming you were thinking about the ability of the Chinese to invest in Afghanistan, and I wondered if you could expand on this relationship and talk to us about how that might progress, and whether or not, if it is about investment, it's particularly persuasive with zealots, or are the Taliban so beyond pragmatism that they are not going to be seduced by China?
I think China's ambitions and aspirations for Afghanistan are really very interesting. The Chinese and the Taliban have had a relationship for quite some time. The Chinese government is very worried about the presence of Islamist activists, extremists on its own territory. As you know, we're seeing what they're doing with Uyghurs in Xinjiang, incarcerating them in vast numbers and effectively trying to wipe out their culture and their identity, as they did with Tibet 20 or 30 years ago. Afghanistan has vast minerals and underground assets that the Chinese have got their eye on. They signed a very big contract with the Afghan government some time ago for a copper deposit close to Kabul called Mezainak. It's one of the second biggest high quality copper. I think it is the second biggest high quality copper deposits in the world. But the Chinese haven't done anything with it. And they use the excuse of security, a lack of security down there. And there was a little bit of trouble when they were building staff quarters. And they have said that they will eventually do something with it, build as they did after the revolution in China. They wanted to develop it into a copper city. So huge employment opportunities for Afghans and building schools and universities, and everything would be like a Chinese-run Shenyang or Baotou or something like that. Now, the Chinese are also the biggest users and producers of copper, and I think it wouldn't be outside imagination to say that they're not doing anything at Mezainak because it's a way of controlling price and flow. So I think that the Chinese ambitions for Afghanistan are very much materialistic. I think that one of the things that they wanted to do from Mezainak in developing it was build a railroad that would go up to the north and then east through the Wakhan corridor into, excuse me, China, so that they could then expand rail networks across Afghanistan so that they could get the stuff that they manufacture in their factory belts on the eastern coast through to Europe faster. So their ambition is to work with whoever will allow them to build infrastructure and mining projects here. It's purely selfish. There are suggestions that they want to expand the Belt and Road project, infrastructure and construction project from Pakistan into Afghanistan. I think that the Afghan government has to be aware of that because of the debt diplomacy that the Chinese infrastructure projects have created in Africa and South Asia and elsewhere. But I don't think there's any doubt that the Chinese have great commercial ambitions for Afghanistan.
Lynne, I guess my specific point, thank you for that. That's really helpful. I think my specific point, though, was if Afghanistan, God forbid, was overrun by the Taliban, would China's Belt and Road extension and their materialist approach to Afghanistan be any influence on the Taliban regime, moderating it or otherwise, because there's a great prize to be had and the Chinese would want a stable country to extract the resource? Or would the Taliban just be going, well, we can see what you've done with the Uyghurs, you are going to be terminating our movement as quickly as you possibly could?
So I want to take Phil's question, because I think it actually poses a question about the nature of the Taliban themselves. And sometimes I think this all-encompassing word Taliban, which is a derivative of the Arabic for student, is putting together a very, very large group that doesn't necessarily have the wherewithal that we might give it. So Lynne, and also Lima, I'll come to you in a second. Well, what do the Taliban want? I mean, they had a few very bad years of running a state. What do they think they can achieve? And that sort of ties into how the Chinese can influence them as well.
The Taliban is an organization that to a great extent has a cohesive leadership that does make an awful lot of money out of both heroin production and export and control of mining assets. They make about $500 million a year just out of minerals mining exports and sales domestically and overseas. So it's all very well to say that on the battlefield, when it gets down to commander level, there is a disparate nature to what we know as the Taliban. But I think that they are very astute businessmen. There is a very cohesive control of freight and highway across the country, and it's done very systematically and in a much better and in many ways a much more welcome way than the government does it. There are there are Afghan police checkpoints all across the highways, but if you go to the Taliban and say, I need to get my stuff from here to here, they'll give you a one road pass that will get you through. It just works and it makes them a lot of money. So to say that they're a broken up, disparate organization across the board is incorrect. They make an awful lot of money already out of 95% or more of the world's heroin trade, and definitely an awful lot of the legal and illegal and artisanal mining in Afghanistan. So if China wants to come in and mine somewhere, the first stop has got to be the Taliban, because they've got more control over it than the government does.
But does that make them able to run a state? Are they in a position where they can take over government and start running ministries? And
no, they can't. I mean, you see them going into villages and districts. They don't offer governance. The Wall Street Journal referred in an article the other day to Taliban governance. They don't do governance. They disrupt, they destroy, they kill, they terrorize, they murder, they target, specific people in a very well thought out campaign. But they don't do governance. They don't provide infrastructure, civil services, education, health, anywhere that they are. So, and I think they're very well aware that their own regime was very close to collapse in 2001 anyway, and they have been given what they have been desperate for 25 years, which is political legitimacy. And they won't have that political legitimacy for long if, number one, they storm in and take over the airport and shoot people trying to get out. And number two, they don't come in and look as if, at least they look as if they're doing deals with, conservatives who will eventually comply with them, with the warlords, whoever, because the warlords are going to be like cats in a bag as well, trying to, protect their own assets and territory. So no, they can't do it on their own, but they're clever. They've learned a lot and they've got a lot of money.
So Lima, are you making any predictions? I mean, politically?
For me, what Lynne has said, I would just have a little bit addition to that. Until I think the Doha Agreement, me as a person who studies Afghanistan academically, I think most of us, we were unsure what the Taliban stands for, because the only thing we know is that they want to fight, it is jihad, they want to fight the invaders. That was the only message we got as Afghan from them. But okay, if they are now winning or they ever win, but even Afghans, we don't know how they want to run the country, like what are us. So after the Doha conference, which a lot of my colleagues that when for first time they faced Afghans, Taliban, the question was, what about us? Like, if this government is removed, the Americans are gone, how we are going to run the country? There is no still answers to those questions also, not even to only women, what the roles of women will be there, but how are you going to provide the country? How are you going to run the country? We still don't have answers to those questions. It's just like, we want to remove them and then we want to bring Islamic rule, but country is in Islamic rule. Right now, the country is an Islamic country. If you could just tell us how the governance will work. That question is still unclear. And recently, I think because of a little bit legitimacy by international community to the Taliban, now their spokesperson is allowed in the media, and Afghan journalists and media have access to them. So whenever they are faced with questions like that, what about, for example, young people going to universities? They just say like, oh, my internet is not working. So those questions, what about women? What about like economy, relationship with different governments, with different countries? Those are the questions that the Taliban leadership, despite having access to so money that Lynne mentioned, they don't have that kind of plan for Afghanistan to run. So until we don't know, it is so hard to comment. The only reality about Taliban we know is that they just are killing and destroying, and the history that we know about their government, we can only imagine that, and we can't imagine anything else.
I'm so grateful to both of you. You've painted a very broad and sort of complex picture. It's been a great learning experience for me. So the question I have now is, having heard about the sort of the West operating a media blackout and not wanting anyone to see that we're retreating with our tail between our legs, and very happy to see our embassies pack up and sort of desert everyone. What do you want to see happen? What kind of engagement do you think is reasonable to expect from the West? And what kind of levels? We're talking governmental, military, what kind of things would you both like to see? Starting with you, Lima.
I think I was the first person starting in 2016 writing how we should transfer the country to Afghan. For me, the engagement from people to people, focus on the people, and talking about not the US withdrawal only, talking about how the country has evolved within violence, within the peace, within the culture, how this country should be a country on the earth where it can still remain a country. And we should talk about all the blind sides. We should not only talk about the country was whatever it is, now we are going, but which kind of violence it might be capable now with this 20 years progress.
Okay, but that's those are your sort of goals and objectives, but how do you achieve that? And what I'm asking is, where should the money be spent? What kind of engagement do you expect to continue? What would you like to continue?
For me, the engagement of the world has to remain, and it has to be more inclusive of the people, the Afghan people, how that engagement should be. It should not be that at West we decide how this country should be led or how this country should be managed. It has to be from the people. It has to come from the people of Afghanistan. That's how I see it.
Okay, Lynne, so in terms of concrete measures, what in one of your articles, you say someone talked about keeping the is it Bagram, the airbase, or I can't remember what was the quote you had from one of your the people you interviewed. What kind of measures would you think would work or should be there to be maintained?
I interviewed the spokesman for the Taliban the other week. I had a 2.5-hour conversation with him on Skype, and he said exactly as Lima has just said. There is no plan, there's no vision for peace. Male-female segregation, women in full hijab, that's all just part of the landscape, and he was very open about that. And he also said that we will continue to fight until we have established an Islamic state. So essentially the message from the Taliban is a forever war of their own. And the losers, of course, are always going to. So what I would like to see is immediately, I would like to see some come back to the narrative, you know, get on with just saying it like it is. And Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, has said over and over, you know, not only that the Afghans have to do it for themselves, but we will be there financially and logistically with support. And I think we all know that the head of NATO wouldn't be able to say that unless the Americans had given him the approval to do so. I'd like to see the Americans come out with some specifics immediately of how they're going to continue to support the Republic's fighting forces, the police and the military and the Air Force, because the only edge they really have over the Taliban on the ground is air support and air attacks. I think that is an immediate imperative. I'd also like to see I'd like to see the Taliban being held to account also to comply with the conditions of the deal that they signed with the US government. They were handed legitimacy. Now it's time for them to step up and be held to account for that legitimacy. I'd like to see the international community come through with the pledges that they made for financial support in Geneva. I would also like to see the government of Ashraf Ghani, which, as Lima very clearly said, the government in Afghanistan has become associated with one man. I would like to see that torn apart a little bit. I'd like to see some real heavy lifting on dealing with the corruption that is at the very core of the Ghani government. And I would like to think that if they are forced to clean up their act, that they won't be brought down by corrupt, because I really believe that corruption is the biggest threat to this government, much more than the insurgency. So there's a few things I'd like to see.
Okay, Lynne, in terms of the sort of Western media coverage of this, I think we're having a conversation about this earlier in the week, and you found this really too sympathetic to the Taliban and giving it sort of too much credence and leverage.
Yeah, there's no holding to account. That's what I would like to see across the board. I see a small cabal of armchair commentators all talking to each other, and US media. I think some of the major titles in the American media landscape have been very much cheerleading the US withdrawal for a long time, and then supporting the concept of an interim government here, which is anti-democratic. I think, yes, I think that there is an effort to support the Taliban, and I think that it's a conscious effort, and it is part of the problem. Yeah, the narrative is all in the hands of the Taliban, and they are the enemies of the Republic, and it has to be broken apart and countered urgently.
Okay. I want to get a couple. We've had some questions from people, but I do want to get a few more. I'm in danger of picking on people on the list of attendees on my right hand side. So please write a few more questions down, or I'm going to start picking on people in class. Tim Ripley, I'm going to come back to you. How realistic does that sound to you? Lynne has said this isn't Saigon. You know, this is not like people. You know, helicopters are going to be falling off buildings as everyone scrambles out of the airport. So there is that. And it's not as if this is, you know, Kabul's about to fall. But how do you see this playing out, Tim?
Well, I agree with this idea about the psychological narrative, because this is, you know, in the history of these Afghan wars, everybody likes to back the winner, even if it's not reality. That there's a sort of herd mentality in which everybody can see or think they know which way it's going, and they all jump on a bandwagon and just to avoid a fight. Everybody, you know, you go back to 2001 with the American invasion, and how there was a prediction that this was going to be a year-long bloodbath. It was going to be 150,000 American troops invading the place. It was all going to be a major war, but it was over in 6 weeks. That the Taliban as we all know, they didn't put up a fight. Apart from a few battles up around Mazar-e Sharif.
Yeah. So you're saying everyone now is getting on the bandwagon to get out. I mean, I'm just trying to pin you down on what point you're making.
Well, the point is that the more you have this narrative, the more that feeds into this bandwagon effect of people thinking what's going to happen rather than what is really going to happen. So I agree that this idea that you have to create this narrative of that it's not inevitable. This inevitability of it has to be countered to make everybody stand back and think, oh, that's not really going to happen. So maybe I shouldn't really, jump off the government bandwagon or jump on the Taliban bandwagon.
And what's the appetite of NATO generally to try and to support the government militarily and indeed the Americans in any way?
Well, there is no appetite to put, US, British, NATO soldiers on the ground. There's no appetite for that. We know that's why they're leaving. There's obviously no appetite for that. I mean, there is potential for air support, much as we saw in 2001 with bombing in support of the Afghan government. That's a possibility. And there's also covert operations. I mean, one of the big sort of successes in 2001 was how the CIA, British SIS, created an alliance against the Taliban and used their black arts and piles of money to buy people off to support their cause. I mean, that is the power of money is still has potential and will be effective. It is almost as effective as bullets.
Yeah, but what I was interested by Lynne's point, making the connection between the refugee crisis in 2014 and NATO's scaling back. And the argument there is that, look, listen, Afghanistan is more relevant than you think it is. There is a cause and effect here. It may not be the most prominent terrorist threat at the moment, but it's certainly linked with Al-Qaeda. Do you buy that? Or more importantly, does the West buy that?
At the moment, they don't. I mean, it's obvious that the British government, the American government are pulling out. They've said it's over,
yeah.
And they are utterly more focused on North Africa, Sahel, Yemen, those places where the insurgency is more active, is more close to home, and has a more immediate impact on the refugee flow than Afghanistan does. I mean, North Africa, Libya, it is all, something happens and within weeks, 100,000 people are in boats heading for Sicily. So it's a more impact than the immediate impact.
Yeah, okay. We've got a brief question from Diane Cook, and then we will wrap it up. Go ahead, Diane.
As you were both of you talking, it was rather depressing, but my question, as I was thinking, is there any evidence that there's likely to be an armed civil society movement in Afghanistan?
What do you mean by that, Diane?
What I mean is it comes from the people. I think Lima was talking about, it's about the people. So people wanting, young people in particular, there are large numbers of them, wanting a decent civil society.
And actually those two things seem to sort of contradict each other, armed and civil society.
Well, yes, but given the types of people you're dealing with, I think the bullet obviously has a place.
Okay, so you're talking about defending their freedoms against the Taliban because the government can't?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Lima, what do you think of that?
I think we have, if Diane has studied Afghanistan history, I think that happened in 70s and 80s when these conducts and small militias were trained. And the idea was that communities will kind of protect themselves, but those militias became the resources for these big warlords that we have today. So the idea was even started in 2017 in 18 there is a root support mission there where I was doing a little bit research that they said we could start with Hazara community to provide weapons that they could protect themselves. But me as an Afghan being rooted there, I don't believe weapon is an answer to the violence itself, because then we are training more violent people to protect us from violence. So a society, that's what Taliban are saying, like, I am protecting my society. Another warlord is saying, I'm just killing people to protect myself. So then we are this weaponized country by the name of protecting myself. So with weapon, I would not see peace coming into the country. For me, it will be more that we have made an environment which is much more possible to bring peace, because the country saw peace at least for few years, and they feel how it feels. There is generations of people that they know how a peaceful country would look like. So it is more attractive to invest a little bit more to keep it that way, to sustain it that way, and slowly make a transition to a country which could be sustainable on its own, rather than living it and starting another blueprint plan with, oh, this is the way it might be. Because for me, a country cannot just be born with just 10 years or 20 years. For me, a country needs to be born and be of an age that could become a sustainable country. So civil society is the point. Right now, we have a strong civil society, but civil society cannot counter bombs. They cannot counter suicide attacks. So what can they do? They can push government for the points that were mentioned before, make government accountable, work towards, like, there are companies and civil society groups that work against the government and pushes them for accountability. Those are the things civil society can do, but they cannot pick up guns and fight.
Okay, Lima, thank you very much. Lynne, I'm just going to ask you one last question, and then we'll wrap it up. What Lima's just talking about is really the achievements of the last 20 years, the building up of Afghan civil society. People who are very much aware of the world, very much aware of their own rights. But on the other hand, this huge vulnerability, this sense of insecurity, and the Taliban at the gates, which really raises the specter of security overall, and the risk possibly of civil war. I mean, is that something that you're concerned about?
And so you dropped out a bit. A return to war, is that what you said?
Yeah, and I'm thinking really about as the US withdraws, you've got major sort of groupings of whether you're talking about sort of different ethnic groupings, but also regional groupings who have got a stake in the game, people who want to preserve their power. And if the state is imploding, where does that go? And my question really is, does that point towards possibly civil war?
I think anything is possible at this stage. I hear what Lima says about perpetuating a cycle of violence if you arm civilians, but that's happening across the country. The government, the Secret Service here, the NDS, is arming citizen militias in a lot of parts of the country, and in some places where the Taliban have entered districts, they're being pushed out by armed, civilians who don't want them amongst them. So that's already happening. And then, as Lima said, the danger of that burgeoning into localized warlordism and fighting is very, very real. I think that we also see the people who are ethnic leaders taking advantage of the weakness of the Ghani government. Ahmad Shah Massoud's son, Ahmad Massoud, in the Panjshir Valley, Abdul Rashid Dostum, the Uzbek leader in the north. The Hazara people are starting to talk very openly about genocide and the grievances against them for the past century. So, even though there is no real and vibrant public debate going on, there is certainly an undercurrent of discussion about whether Afghanistan can and will survive in its current form. So, yeah, anything is possible.
Okay. Well, we've got messages coming through here to thank both of you, you, Lima, and also Lynne, for your time. And there's a specific message here from Elaine Moore, who says, thank you to you both for all that you do in your work. So my thanks to both of you for a very, very enlightening discussion. It's been a very tough discussion, a difficult discussion, but a very, very informative one. My thanks to both of you, to Lynne O'Donnell and to Lima Halima-Ahmed. Thank you very much indeed.